Chernobyl reactor 4 is now a nuclear bomb.
No. Hey everyone, Charlie here from the Atomic Age, and welcome back to Nuclear Engineer Reacts. And today we're covering the ultimate episode of Chernobyl, Part 5, The Trial. In the interim, I asked you guys for any questions you had about Chernobyl in particular. I probably should have been a little more specific in that I really meant what was in the show. You guys had a lot of questions. I decided for this video that I'm going to keep the format just like the other entries in the series, and that is react directly to what's in the show, break down anything that I think needs some elaboration, or refute any claims I think need refuting. But yeah, so during my research and with all your guys' questions, I realized how complex of an accident Chernobyl was. And this really has to do with the very complicated cooling system that an RBMK reactor has. So I think I want to do a separate video, maybe even a separate series about the Chernobyl accident where I actually explain it. This video here isn't the proper format for that because this is about the show and not really about my independent analysis of the accident. So would that be enough for you guys? Some kind of a video series about my explanations of the Chernobyl accident? Or would you actually like me to address some of those questions directly in a Q&A style type video? Let me know in the comments below. Before we get started, in case you guys didn't know, I have a Patreon. If you head over there, you can check it out. Got uncut reactions for Chernobyl Part 5, Back to the Future, and Chernobyl Part 4. So head on over and see if anything there interests you. I greatly appreciate it. And like I normally do, I like to check out some comments from last time, so let's get into that right now. Alright, so comment here from Dimitri. Even when the reactor is stopped, new atoms of xenon are still produced from other radioactive elements. So after 8 to 9 hours, the levels of xenon would still be high. Very good point. I did not mention that last time. The xenon is a latent thing because it comes primarily from another fission product, iodine. I forget the specific isotope number. I'm sure I'll write it below, but the half-life of that and its daughter nuclides has to play out before you get the bulk of the xenon being produced. So it does not stop once the reactor stops or once you change power level. It's a rather complex dynamic. All right, we got this comment here from Brian Bowman. He's very familiar with increased security since all of his experience with nuclear powers and NPP. Almost nothing is okay to just release to the public. Yes, okay, so this is an important caveat. Of course, you do not want like security related things about power plants to be just generally available to the public, not because they don't know any better, but bad actors could want to do bad things with this type of information. Where I come from in transport, there's not a lot that really needs to be kept secret. So what really is just kept secret in transport is mostly company proprietary information. Certain shipments may have like increased security, or it's not like you're going to necessarily know when things are being shipped. So there's like a difference between day-to-day things, keeping that kind of thing secret so a bad actor can exploit it, versus the overall design and safety of a particular item, such as a package or a power plant or a reactor, or like the fallout pattern for the evacuation of a reactor or stuff like that kind of thing. Now, the caveat I do want to make is that someone in Homyuk's position should be able to get access to this info. She should not be restricted to it because she's an investigator. So that's really like the main gist I was trying to get at too, is that she should be able to, if she's officially involved in the investigation, she should not have any restrictions on the information she can get access to. All right, guys, and so there wasn't too much to address for this Part 4 episode. That one's really kind of just a really emotional one. There's not too much solid in that one to talk about, but yeah, let's get into Part 5 of Chernobyl.
The West is now satisfied that Chernobyl was solely the result of operator error, which it essentially was.
For any big accidents like Chernobyl, or 3 Mile Island for that matter, or plane crashes, if you stop at operator error, that is to say just blaming the humans involved in the accident, you may be missing out on systemic issues that preclude the operators to act in certain ways. So only stopping at blaming the humans can be satisfying in the short term, but you will likely not get all the answers you need to prevent this type of accident from happening again.
In an RBMK reactor of the type used at Chernobyl, there's something called a positive void coefficient. The more steam present within the system, the higher the reactivity, the negative temperature coefficient. When nuclear fuel gets hotter, it gets less reactive.
So these two coefficients he's talking about are the void coefficient of reactivity and the fuel coefficient of reactivity. There's one more, and that's the moderator coefficient of reactivity. And these all three fall under what is called the power coefficient of reactivity. And that basically determines whether the power is increasing or decreasing in your reactor. And it's based on fuel, it's based on void, and it's based on the moderator. So like he said, as fuel temperature increases, reactivity decreases. And this is because the uranium-238 in the fuel, which is the non-fissile part, as it heats up, it becomes better at absorbing neutrons as they slow down from fast, which is the neutrons fresh from a split atom, down to thermal, which is where you want your neutrons to be. That's the easiest way to split uranium-235 atoms, is when they're slow, what we call thermal, because they're in thermal equilibrium with their surroundings. So in between the fast and thermal regimes is where uranium-238 absorbs neutrons in what is called the resonance region. So as the fuel heats up, these resonances become bigger, and they're more likely to absorb neutrons. So that's where the reduction in reactivity comes from increasing fuel temperature. Now the void coefficient. So void is just a way to say steam in a reactor. It's so much denser than liquid water that there might as well not be any water in that space where a void occurs. So the void has a huge impact on reactivity and neutrons and moderation. To discuss void coefficient, we have to talk about optimal moderation. Basically, optimal moderation comes when you have the proper ratio of moderator to fuel. And what this means is that you can get the least amount of material possible to get a chain reaction. So there's two other states other than optimally moderated. There's under-moderated and there's over-moderated. In the under-moderated system, you have more fuel than moderator. So if you take moderator away, you're reducing neutron moderation and you're reducing reactivity. So then the under-moderated reactor has the negative void coefficient. Removing moderator removes reactivity. If you were to space these rods further apart, you would get closer to an optimally moderated system and your reactivity would go up, but that's not possible in a reactor. So in the over-moderated example, you can see that there's more moderator than fuel. That is to say, there's just too much moderator for neutrons to travel around in, and they get picked off by some moderating atom, and they don't fission atoms. So in this instance, if you were to remove moderator, you get closer to an optimally moderated system, and your reactivity goes up. So this is what happens in the RBMK reactor with its over-moderated nature, leading to a positive void coefficient. So the graphite is fixed, right? It's a chunk of graphite. It can't be turned into a gas. It's fixed. It's stuck there. Whereas the water changes around. The RBMK is a boiling type reactor, so water actually boils right next to the fuel to turn into steam. This changes your moderation on the fly very quickly, as water can move from steam to liquid. So if the water goes to steam, and this happens when power is increased because it makes the water hotter and the water turns into steam when it becomes hot. As the water turns to steam, that over-moderation goes away. It approaches optimal moderation. So in the over-moderated state, you needed more fuel to reach a critical system. But when you take away that water and you go to the optimally moderated state, that fuel is still there, but you've removed moderators. So you're now in an elevated reactivity position. And an under-moderated reactor, like a PWR or a BWR, that is to say a pressurized water reactor or a boiling water reactor, or even the Russian VVER, which is a PWR reactor in all intents and purposes, just a different name. They're negative void coefficients because they're under-moderated. If the water goes away, the reaction goes away. So you can see the inherent safety built into that. Whereas with the RBMK reactor, it's over-moderated. If the water goes away, the reaction goes up. Now, as Legasov was saying, this is not inherently a bad feature. When it turns out at full power, this positive void coefficient is overrun by the negative fuel coefficient. So the fuel heating up and being hot removes more reactivity than water turning to steam adds. However, as the reactor gets to low power, the fuel cools down. So that negative fuel coefficient becomes less important than the positive void coefficient. So then at low power, the positive void is driving all the reaction. Now with the moderator coefficient, that's more of a water reactor thing, the effect of that, the moderator temperature. There will be a slight effect here in an RBMK, and that's basically just as the temperature of the moderator increases, its density decreases. That's not counting the fact that water turns to steam. Anything when it heats up, its density decreases. So the graphite density will decrease, the water density will decrease. So this has a small effect on controlling the reactor, but the main two ones here are the fuel temperature coefficient and the void coefficient. So those three things determine what the power of your reactor is going to be as you make changes to it.
As uranium splits apart to release energy, it breaks down into a new element, xenon. Xenon reduces reactivity. This is the poison Comrade Homut mentioned.
Not only does xenon reduce reactivity, it is perhaps the strongest neutron absorber known to humanity. So its presence is very important in determining the reactor's operation. I don't want to jump ahead of myself too much here talking about the xenon pit. We'll get to that, but I have thoughts, and they're coming.
When the core is running at full power, it burns the xenon away before it can cause a problem.
And just to clarify, burning away xenon means that an atom of xenon has absorbed a neutron. So once xenon has absorbed a neutron, it is no longer a poison. It is just another atom inside your reactor at that point.
Right, switch off local automatic control. Go to global. Leonid.
LAC disabled, global control activated.
Jesus.
What did you do?
I did what you said, I switched.
Look at it!
So at this point in time, this 30 megawatt reading is purely from radioactive decay activity. There is no chain reaction happening in this reactor whatsoever at this moment.
What are you doing?
We have to shut all the way down.
No.
Well, we could be in a xenon pit. We have to shut down, wait 24 hours.
No, we're doing the test tonight. Raise power to 700.
We can't raise the power from here for rules.
Don't talk to me about rules.
If we fall from 80%...
No, we fell from 50% of power.
50%, it's even
The rules
worse.
don't say 50. There is no rule.
There is no known... We don't really know what happened in the control room other than what was written in operator logs, and this is because there's no like cockpit voice recorder in the control room, like for an airplane crash or something like that. So all we have to base off of the decisions that were made were what was written in the logbook, and then just the testimony of the men that were there. There's basically two possibilities. They knew about the Xenon pit and just tried to push through it, or two, they didn't know about the Xenon pit, which I read that somewhere that someone was I think it was more of a snide remark that they wouldn't know about the Xenon pit because say you were a nuclear physicist building a reactor for the first time. After several hours, your reactor would probably shut itself down from xenon because you weren't expecting that to happen because you didn't know about it. It was unknown before the first chain reactions were done. That is to say, it was a very early discovery in the realm of nuclear engineering. So they should be very well aware of the fact that xenon pits exist, and xenon is something that has to be controlled for in a reactor.
There were 211 control rods in reactor 4. Akimov and Toptonov completely withdrew 205. Remember, control rods are the brakes on this car. Of 211 rods, only 6 now remain in the reactor.
So when a reactor is operating at full power, most of the control rods will be out. It's really the fact that they're at this low power state with all these other factors that removing all these control rods is a main issue. And there's also supposed to be like a control rod reserve of there's supposed to be always 30 control rods in this reactor. that is the main reason why having all these control rods withdrawn is the issue.
The fully withdrawn control rods begin moving back into the reactor. These rods are made of boron, which reduces reactivity, but not the tips. The tips are made of graphite, which accelerates reactivity.
Why?
All right, so the control rods with their graphite tips, this question of the graphite tips has been a very prevalent one in my comments section. So, having looked into it further, the control rods were not graphite tipped. Tipped would imply like a very small segment that's a very small percentage of the overall length of the control rod. A quick overview of control rods. These are made of boron, which is a very strong neutron absorber. And if you have a chain reaction problem in your reactor or you need to shut it down for any reason whatsoever, you insert these boron control rods and they absorb all the neutrons flying around, and it ends your reaction on the spot. At least that's how it's supposed to work. So with the RBMK reactor here, most of these control rods actually have what is actually called a graphite displacer. And this is a section that's separated from the control rod absorbing section by a small distance. So there's water on either sides of this graphite section of the control rod, and there's also water between the graphite and the boron section of the control rod. So the reason for this is that the RBMK is a very low enrichment reactor. That's one of its benefits, is that it can run really low enrichment, which is economically beneficial because enriching fuel costs money. So what the graphite displacers do is they displace water in the channels that they occupy. So water is the best moderator out there because it has hydrogen in it. The lighter your element, the better a moderator it is, and you can't get any lighter than hydrogen. Yet, the RBMK reactor does not use water as a moderator. It uses it as a coolant. It uses graphite as a moderator. So, graphite is made of carbon, which is 6 times heavier than hydrogen, so not as good of a moderator. But graphite's benefit is that it has a very low neutron absorption cross-section, which means it is very unlikely to absorb a neutron. So while hydrogen may be the best moderator, it has a higher absorption cross-section than graphite, which means it's more likely to absorb some neutrons. So this is getting back to that over-moderated thing from earlier in the discussion. So what, like I mentioned earlier, when you're running at full power, you actually don't have that many control rods in the reactor. It's really just to kind of control the power distribution, make sure power is evenly distributed. So when you have the control rod out, and if there's just a solid water channel there, that absorption ability of water will suck up some neutrons and reduce your overall power. So to counteract that, you have this graphite part on the control rod that will, it displaces water and then it won't absorb as many neutrons. So it'll keep your power up. So like I said, they're not tips. They're the same, just about the same length, I believe, as the boron section of the control rod. But when the control rods are fully withdrawn, there is a section of water beneath the graphite rod where there's fuel around it. So when they pressed the scram button, the control rod started moving down, and this graphite started displacing water in the lower section of the core. And this is where a lot of the bad chain reaction parts were happening in the reactor. So the water down there is over moderating at the moment, so it's absorbing some neutrons. It's keeping the power a little bit lower. So the fact that the graphite has to go through that water column first actually increases the power, increases the amount of neutrons flying around, decreases absorption. That's what's going on with these control rods, and that's where the issue comes into play, is that they allowed this part of water to exist at the bottom of the reactor that would then get displaced by graphite, increasing power briefly. That took a while to explain, so maybe they just simplified it to graphite tips in this show, because it's effectively the same thing going on with a graphite tip versus this graphite displacer thing. It's pushing water out of the way and instead putting graphite in its place. So it makes the explanation much simpler without having to use pictures or trying to describe where water is or any of that other kind of stuff. So it's not technically correct. I don't want to say it's wrong, but graphite tips conveys a much smaller section of the rod. Whereas, and then like, we're about to get into it more with him talking about it being cheap and everything, but this was a purposefully designed part of the reactor, was these graphite displacers to keep the power level even in the reactor when the control rods are withdrawn in a certain spot.
For the same reason, our reactors do not have containment buildings around them, like those in the West. For the same reason, we don't use properly enriched fuel in our cores. For the same reason, we are the only nation that builds water-cooled, graphite-moderated reactors with a positive void coefficient. It's cheaper.
Oh my god. All right, so the lower enrichment part is also a very interesting piece of this puzzle. They wanted to keep the enrichment low because that makes fuel costs cheaper. So when you have the lower enrichment, you need to have as few absorbers as possible to keep the power up. So a main consequence of having this low enrichment was the situation they created here, where they had this low power state where all the rods were withdrawn and the fuel was cold. So the only thing that controlled power was the positive void coefficient, which is a positive feedback loop. So not good. One of the ways they fixed this was to increase the enrichment from 1.8% to finally 2.4%. And that's a percentage U-235 by weight, which is the fissile part. So when you have that higher enrichment, you need more absorbers in it to counteract the increased power production. So in that way, if you have all the control rods withdrawn, there's more fixed absorbers in place that make it so the reactor power is not only dependent on the positive void fraction in those circumstances. There's neutron absorbers in place that help prevent that kind of situation. And then another thing with the lower enrichment is, so generally speaking with reactors, the lower the enrichment, the bigger the reactor has to be. You just have less fissile atoms, so you need more stuff in one space to be able to get the kind of power that you need and to be able to run the fuel for the amount of time that you need. So like the reactors on nuclear submarines are very small because they're very highly enriched, like north of 90% enrichment. So this reactor was so big that it almost behaved as if there were separate reactors all in one space. And what I mean is, it's so big that neutrons would not travel from one part of the reactor to the other. So you could have localized power decreases in one spot or a localized criticality in one spot. So that added to this accident, this very hard to control, very large, almost decoupled reactor. And that stems from the use of the super low enrichment fuel. Okay, now he also mentioned containment buildings. This is something I myself was very curious about as to whether a Western-style containment building would have helped in this accident. And I haven't looked into it too deeply because that's way out of my field, that explosion kind of stuff. But it looks like that it would not have been able to contain this explosion. Estimates for this explosion put it around 1 terajoule, or about 200 tons of TNT, which is a very big explosion. The containment buildings for reactors that you may see are designed to handle all the water in the primary coolant loop turning to steam. And then water turning to steam makes a huge pressure increase because steam is so much less dense than water. And then also these containment buildings can survive airplane strikes. But an airplane strike or that level of steam does not approach a 200-ton TNT explosion. So it's not certain whether a containment building would have helped in this situation. Another example to point to in that instance is the Fukushima disaster, where those containment buildings also exploded from hydrogen explosions, which we'll be getting into here shortly.
The graphite tips are fixed in position, endlessly accelerating the reaction. Chernobyl Reactor 4 is now a nuclear bomb.
No. It is not a nuclear bomb in the sense that we think of a nothing like that. It is being set up to be a supercritical nuclear chain reaction, which does not automatically mean you have a nuclear bomb. A nuclear bomb is a very deliberately designed weapon, very hard to make. And the configuration of a reactor is just the opposite of a bomb. Now, it's not to say that you can't get a supercritical reaction in a nuclear reactor. You most certainly can. But what you get is what happened at Chernobyl.
Explosion.
Which was obviously not a nuclear explosion as we think of it. You know, nothing like a Hiroshima or modern thermonuclear weapons, nothing like that. The main differences for the nuclear bomb is that there's no moderator present. There's tons of moderator in this reactor. There's no absorbers present in a nuclear bomb. There's tons of absorbers in the immediate vicinity of this reactor. Not immediately in it, but the water is partially an absorber, and there are some control rods still in the reactor. But there's all kinds of materials and impurities that you would not want in your bomb. The enrichment is also way too low in here to be a bomb. There's way too much uranium-238, which can absorb neutrons and also just dilutes your fissile material. So this will not be a nuclear bomb in that sense, but what you can get is a supercritical reaction in a portion of the core, which creates an insane amount of power in an insanely short time. And a lot of power in a short time is called an explosion. The reactor itself is a very rigid object, so it can maintain its structure for a long enough time that the power and pressure can build up to make an explosion-like event. I work in nuclear package transportation safety, and one of the things I work to prevent is what happened in the reactor, which is a supercriticality. There have been several of these types of accidents over the decades, and none of them have resulted in nuclear explosions. And that's because it's just, like I mentioned earlier, it's just not set up like a bomb is. But it does release a large amount of power, and in the typical place where that kind of accident happens is like a fuel production facility where you're enriching fuel and moving it around from place to place, and it can accumulate in one spot, and it can go, if you're not very careful, it can go critical, which is very bad, of course. But usually those kinds of things tend to control themselves before they can get any faster, and they're usually moderated, like I mentioned earlier, so neutrons are being slowed down, which keeps the reaction from happening too quickly, like in a bomb. Bomb happens very quickly. The principal nuclear part of a nuclear bomb is over within microseconds of time. After that, it has blown itself apart, and is just the immense amount of power made in that local spot is what you see afterwards. So then you don't ever see the nuclear bomb really happening if you watch footage of it. It's shorter than a video frame. What you're just seeing is the resultant superheated gas and plasma at the center, forcing everything out afterwards. Not a nuclear bomb, but it can be definitely you can get explosions from supercriticalities going on here. The proper term for this instance would be a nuclear excursion.
At long last, we have arrived. 123:45, explosion. In the instant the lid is thrown off the reactor, oxygen rushes in. It combines with hydrogen and superheated graphite. The chain of disaster is now complete.
Every time. There are several theories out there about what happened here. I don't believe it's something that will ever be known definitively what happened here at Chernobyl. And when I say that, I there's no like smoking gun evidence. We can make very educated guesses as to what happened. The main thinking is that there was a first steam explosion, and this is caused by the huge power surge, so it just flashed a ton of water to steam really quickly, and then that blew the lid off and did that first explosion that they show with the lid popping off there. And then the second explosion has been hypothesized to be a hydrogen explosion. So once the lid blew off and all that water turned to steam and got outside the reactor, you had rapid oxidation of graphite and zirconium by water, which turns it into hydrogen and oxygen, and then that's ripe for a hydrogen explosion. Now, it has also been hypothesized that there was a a nuclear excursion in several of the fuel channels, a localized excursion that happened so quickly as to not destroy the fuel channel, but use it as almost like a cannon and propel some nuclear debris very high into the atmosphere. And this is based on a paper that showed that some factory in like Moscow, far away in the Soviet Union, detected levels of fission product, the material you get after you split a uranium atom, so far away from the explosion and in such a short amount of time that it would have had to have gotten in the really high upper atmosphere to move that kind of distance based on weather patterns and stuff like that. So that is also hypothesized as part of the first explosion. So yeah, but that is the general sequence of the events. An initial smaller explosion, which was also described by witnesses and firefighters as sounding like a normal steam release. And then the second explosion is what really was like the huge explosion that left the building destroyed, basically.
We are so focused on our search for truth, we fail to consider how few actually want us to find it. The truth doesn't care about our needs or wants. It doesn't care about our governments, our ideologies, our religions. Where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies?
All right, guys, so there we go. Chernobyl Part 5 is done. Overall, I love the show. I think it's great. I remember when I first watched it, I was just blown away by, just a modern show about Chernobyl. I've seen some previous ones from the past, but some of them show their age, but this one I think is great. My only real major gripes with the series are the corium lava megaton explosion thing. That just can't happen. I think I want to make a separate video about that, but in the meantime, look up Thunderfoot's video on it. He does a really good job explaining why that can be a megaton explosion. Also, I don't view the show as anti-nuclear. I never got that vibe from it, even the first time I watched it. And this is coming from a nuclear engineer for what that's worth, but I view the show really being anti-RBMK, anti-lack of safety culture, anti-lack of safety features. I don't see the show as being anti-nuclear. It never struck me that way. Someone in the comments mentioned recently that they liked that I did not nitpick every little thing about the show, and I greatly appreciate that as a comment. It's a dramatic piece. There's always going to be license taken. There's always going to have to be things condensed, like Homuk's character being a bunch of different scientists condensed into one. This isn't a documentary, guys. It's a dramatic piece. There's going to be liberties. There's going to be license. So I think we as a society need to realize that dramatic pieces are dramatic pieces and that they're not supposed to be 100% accurate. It's supposed to... This show did a really good job of evoking the feelings of being in this accident, and that's what is important about it. It gives you that ground feel sense of what it was like to be there. This isn't an accident report. This isn't a documentary. That's not the aim of this series. So as long as we keep that in mind, I think we can better enjoy some dramatic pieces now. They can have a tendency to promote some outdated modes of thinking, such as reactors exploding like Hiroshima, like nuclear bombs, or the megaton lava thing. But other than that, it's a dramatic piece, and it's more about evoking... It's supposed to make you feel something. If a movie doesn't make you feel something, it may as well just not be a movie. Like, just don't even waste your time. Be sure to let me know what you think about my own series about the Chernobyl accident versus doing just like a Q&A video, or both. And a reminder from earlier about my Patreon. I don't run ads. I prefer a grassroots supported internet. I think we'd all be better off if we had more of that and less advertising driven funding of the internet. So head on over to my Patreon if that interests you. We got uncut reactions for Chernobyl's Part 4 and 5 and Back to the Future. But yeah, so that'll wrap up the Chernobyl miniseries, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.